let me know if you want me to pause or go over anything again. Just let me know. So I'm recording now. I'm recording my bottom screen, so I'm not recording the Discord chat, and I'm not recording the audio. So if you talk, you're not going to be on the recording, just in case, just so you guys are aware of that. But I will be able to hear you. Okay, so let's take a look at JavaScript statements first. We're just going to do this quick as a way to kind of get ready for the main thing that we're going to be doing. But I want to make sure that we don't. Sometimes, it's like we're just throwing a bunch of code all over the place, and we're not talking about the sort of fine-grained details of what is happening in the code. So for this one, the first thing I'm going to do, let's reset this. Slide page real quick. Statements. Okay. So we're going to talk about how to write a statement in code. We've already kind of done that a bunch. We've been writing all these functions and stuff like that, but we're going to get a little bit more into the specifics of what all the different characters mean. And for this part, I'm just going to use the console. So I'm in Chrome. I'm just going to open up the JavaScript console. So just as a reminder, I can hit Command and Option J all at the same time to toggle the console open. For Windows, it's Control Shift J. This is both for Chrome. If you're using a different browser, there's going to be some other key commands. But you can also open up the console by going to the menu and going to Tools and going to Developer Tools. That actually closed it for me because I already had it open. But yeah, so once you open Developer Tools, sometimes you'll be on Elements when you first open it, and you can just find the console thing here. And I'm zooming in a little bit just to make it more visible on screen, but obviously you don't have to do that. So if you want to follow along, you can do that. And so we're just going to talk about really quickly the basics of syntax. So here we have a really simple statement that creates a variable. Okay, so I'm going to simplify this even more. So I'm just going to call this variable s, and I'm going to say equals, and then the string hello world. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different parts in this statement, and so we're going to learn each one bit by bit. So the first one is this var. That's called a keyword. In JavaScript, we have a few different types of text, and one of them is a keyword. So a keyword is anything that is reserved by the language. So we can't use var for other stuff. It only means that we're declaring a variable. There's a couple other ways to declare variables that we'll talk about later, but this is one of the ways that we're going to use. So variable, var is just short for variable, which is a programming concept that we're going to be discussing in depth today. Then the next piece of text, so then there's a space. In coding and programming, the space is meaningful. It separates the different types of text. So the first type of text is our keyword, which is sort of setting up what we're about to do with this line of code. And then the space is saying like we're done with the keyword, we're moving on to the next part. And there's a few different options for what can come after that, depending on what you wrote. But your program is going to expect specific things. So for example, if I try to say something like variable and then just say equals hello world, I'm going to get an error. It's going to say you can't just go straight from variable to equals. There has to be something in between there. And so that is where we write the name of our variable. And the name of the variable is really anything you want it to be, any sequence of characters that you want it to be. In JavaScript, we always start with a lowercase letter. You don't really have to do that, and there's some cases where you don't do that, but that's the convention. So a convention is sort of like stylistic. It's not functional. Like if I say variable capital S equals hello world, it will work just as well. But it will be technically a different variable. So, S and capital S, even though I put the same data in there, they are technically different variables. So let's go back to our first statement. So then I have another space. This space is actually optional. I don't really have to use this space here, I don't think. Let's see, if I say variable S equals hello, yeah, it'll let me do that. So that second space here is also stylistic. So it's a little tricky when you're first learning. This space, you have to have it or it won't work. This space is kind of optional. JavaScript doesn't really care if you have it or not. Um, Stylistically, it's much easier to read because it's much easier to see when your variable name ends and when your operator begins. This equal sign is called an operator, and we'll look at a bunch of those. An operator is basically just like any type of operation. So it can be assigning variables, it can be doing math like adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing. Any symbol that does something in our code that's not like, part of our text is called an operator. So it performs some type of operation. The equal sign is an operator that assigns a value to a variable. So on one side of our statement, we have the variable that we want to create, and on the other side of our equal sign, we have the value that we want to assign to that variable. And a variable really is just a way of giving some data a nickname so that we can use it multiple times. We saw that in the JT's example with his self-portrait where he had variable names for his different colors. So that way he could create a color and then use the same name for that color whenever he was going to apply that color to a specific shape. So that's really all a variable is. It's quite simple, but it's very it's important to know. It's sort of like our main basic thing that we have to learn before everything else starts to fit together. Um, Audio is not working. I think I'm not sure. You may need to restart Discord, or you could check the settings and just make sure that you have the right. You might want to check sometimes, like if you go into settings on Discord, sometimes it thinks that you are using like headphones or something else that you're not using. So I would check settings first, and then I would try just restarting the program if that doesn't work. Is everybody else's audio working okay? Um, okay, so yeah, I don't know. I would just check out the settings and then try restarting the app if that doesn't fix anything. So I'm gonna keep going, but let me know if you aren't able to fix that. Um, Okay, so that's our operator. So then this space is also optional. Again, this is stylistic. I like having a space here because it makes it easier to read, but it is technically an optional space, this one right here, before our data. Finally, we get to our data. This is what we are sort of like assigning to our variable. So when we create a variable, we're basically telling the computer, like, go find some memory somewhere. Computers have memory, right? When you're using a computer, I'm sure you guys, when you've looked at buying a computer in the past, you've seen that they have RAM and they have a hard drive. And your RAM is random access memory. That's like a certain amount of memory that's allocated to when you're actually using the computer. So that's like what your computer is doing right now to feed you the video that we're all looking at and to communicate with the internet. It's using RAM to randomly associate data and things that are happening, network communications, whatever it is, on that disk. When you save a file, you're committing a file to your hard drive or download a program. That's using your hard drive. So it's saying, we always want this file to exist. So find somewhere on your hard drive and put this file there. And then when I need it later, I'm going to open it later. But when you open the file, it takes all the data from the file and it puts it into your RAM so that you can, go into Photoshop and change the color or do other stuff. So anyway, when we create a variable, we're basically telling the computer, go find a little bit of memory, just like a tiny little bit of memory, and name it S or sentence or whatever you call it, and put this data in there. And so the data we're putting there is just this string, hello world. And so that way, once we write this statement and execute the statement, we have access to this variable S, and all we have to do is write S, and we get that data back. So it's basically like creating like a shortcut or a nickname or a proxy. There's lots of different words for it. So that's our data here, and we have different data types. We'll go over that in a second. And then normally in JavaScript, we end a statement with a semicolon. This is also optional. You can see that JavaScript has a lot of optional components because it wants to make it easier to write. But stylistically, the semicolon is good, visually, and there are some functional cases where you want to have semicolons. So normally, any code that I write, you'll see with semicolons. There's lots of developers who prefer not to use semicolons. So I can write another variable and say, this variable A is 100, and you can see I didn't use a semicolon and it still worked. So semicolon is optional. Stylistically, it's useful, and functionally, it's useful in some cases. Um, so it's kind of a matter of preference. I tend to use them, or I actually always use them, but when I'm teaching, I use them because that is sort of the accepted style for most studios and agencies and blah blah blah. So that's why I teach it that way. But again, it's a little bit of a preference. Okay, let's keep going. Uh-oh. Oh, you know what I did? Capital S is already a variable that is being used by my slides program, which is written in JavaScript. So now that's why I'm getting all those errors. So we are going to have to refresh the page, and now it'll work again. Okay. So we talked about the white space. We talked about the assignment operator. So another thing with the assignment operator, it looks like equals, but it doesn't really mean equals. And we'll talk about this more in a couple weeks. But in JavaScript, when I say something like x equals 1, I'm not really saying that the value of x is equal to 1 like I would mean in math. What I'm really saying is I want a variable called x, and I want to give that variable the value 1. And so I'll often say the word gets instead of equals when I'm talking about assignment, because I'm really saying like this is a variable and it gets this value, as opposed to like this is a number and it is equal to this value. So once I assign x equals 1, and we don't have to worry about this too much right now. In a couple weeks, we will talk about a lot more about this. But if I want to actually compare values, I would use a double equal sign. So if I say x double equals 1, then I'm actually comparing the value that I stored in x to the numerical value 1. So if I say x equals 2, that's going to be false. If I say 2 equals 2, that's going to be true. So it's a little confusing in programming that we use this equal sign, which has a very specific meaning in math, to do something different, but it's just how we do it. So that's something that we will, continue to talk about. Okay, so we made a variable. There's a lot more information if you go just to learn about variables on MDN. There's a lot of info here if you want to review that more. I also have a link to a Code Academy interactive tutorial that you guys can use that's on the schedule somewhere. Okay, so making our variables. So technically there's two steps in the statement that we just wrote. One is declaring a variable. We're just declaring that it exists. So for example, if I say right now, there's probably no variable n. If I just say n, it says n is not defined. There's no variable called n. I can define a variable by saying variable n, and I'll put a semicolon here, you don't have to, but when I execute that, just by hitting enter in the console, now if I say n, notice that it still says it's not defined, it says undefined, but I don't get an error here. So n exists, the variable n exists, it's just undefined. I haven't given it a value. That's the second part of the statement. That's assignment. So once I have a variable, I can assign it. I can say n equals 10. And so now n has the value of 10. So those are two parts, and you can do them separately or you can do them together. But we want to make sure we understand the two parts that are happening there. So declaration is just declaring this thing exists. Assignment is actually putting some data into this variable. Okay, let's keep going. So when we do those things together, it's called initializing a variable. It's creating a variable and giving it its first value, because the value may change. Variable also means change. It can change over time. And that's something that a variable that we'll see next week, that's what variables are used for, is actually to change values, not just to store them. But yeah, so that's called initialization or initializing a variable. This is just kind of vocab, just so you guys know what those words mean. But when you talk about programming, we have these kind of like specific words that mean specific things when we're writing code. So it makes it so we can talk about code. We actually already have talked about data, so I'll go through this really quickly. But we have different types of data. So we have numbers, which can either be a whole number like 10, or a float or decimal point number like 10.5. There's also infinity. I don't know why we need to know that, but it exists. Um, and there are strings. Strings are just strings of characters. So this string 10, even though we know that it means the number 10, the computer just sees it as the string ten. It doesn't know that there's a numerical value there. So for example, I can't say, or 10, whoops, equals 10. That's not true, because even though we can see those values as being equivalent, they're different. They're different things. One is a number and the other is a string that happens to have the English meaning of 10, but to the computer, it doesn't mean anything. um, we can check for types. I think we already talked about this, but we can say type of 10 is a number, type of 10 is a string, and then we can check if things are numbers. So if I say like number uh, of 10, I'm going to get this nan. Nan, if you ever see that when you're writing something, that means not a number. That means you tried to do something that you can't do most of the time. So if I tried to say like 10 times 10 or something like that, I'm going to get nan, which is not a number. All right. So yeah, so strings store messages. We can add strings together. That's one thing that's a little counterintuitive. Usually when you do 1 plus 1, when you do addition, you expect it to be a numerical value, but we can actually add strings. I can say hello plus Jerry, and that's going to give me the string hello with all of those letters together. If I want to, have a space in there, space is another character, so I have to do that. Let's go through these. And we've already talked about operators. So yeah, we can add and subtract. We already know that. Multiply and divide. Concatenation is the official word for when you add strings together. Let's not worry about this right now. We're going to get into it later. Okay, so that's good enough for us to get started. Let's actually use this in a P5 context. So let's go back to our week 3 schedule. And so we're going to talk about variables again, and we're going to actually use them in our code this time. So I'm going to close this. Oops. Let's close this and go back to the beginning. There we go. And I'm going to open up my P5 editor. And I'm just going to get started with a couple examples. So before I get to my self-portrait, I'm just going to do a couple examples here. So I'll just call these variable examples. All right. So as we talked about, we have a few different types of text when we're writing code. We have keywords. You can see some keywords here, function, and we'll add var in a second, or variable. Variable names, these are names that we come up with as programmers, and these are names for either our variables or our functions. So even though we personally didn't come up with setup, it is something that the people who wrote P5 came up with. It's not like a default part of JavaScript. Create canvas, background, draw. Those are all the same things. Eventually, we're going to start writing our own variable names. Actually, we're going to start doing it today. And then hard data is anything that has a number, string, or Boolean value. So the numbers that we use to place the shapes, the numbers that we use to create colors, or the strings that we use to create colors, those are all called hard data. That means that they're not going to change. They're not stored anywhere. They're just pieces of data. Um, and so that's what I'll be talking about a lot when I talk about variables versus hard data. When something's hard coded, that means everything is using a number. And so it can't be interactive, it can't be animated, the numbers can't be changed over time by the program. When we institute variables in place of hard data, then we can make things interactive or animated, because we can vary, we can change the numbers that those variables stand in for. Um, so let's go ahead and write some variables. And so here's an example. Where we have, this is just all hard coded. And so this is just a little self-portrait example. You can see all of this is hard coded stuff. So these 200, 200, that's hard coded, the strings, oh, my mouse is in the wrong place. That's weird. Um, anyway, all of this is hard coded. What we're going to work towards is adding in things that are variables so we can change the values that we're using. Um, so let's look at that example. Okay, so down here, I've added in a couple of variables. I have this eye size variable, and then I have a color saved as the face color. And so we can see it's the same thing, but one of the conveniences about using variables is I can change one number and it's going to update both of my eyes. So that's just one example. There's a lot of other stuff that we can do with variables, but that's what kind of basically what we're going to look at today. So I'm going to do a couple examples of this, and then we'll look at how we're going to add it into our self-portrait. So for this one, let's say I have like a pattern. So I'm just going to make a pattern real quick. I'm just going to use some circles. So I'm going to do a circle at 100, 100, 100. Okay, and then I'll make another circle like that. Let's make this a little bit bigger. I'll make like a polka dot pattern. Okay. And then I'm just going to take a couple of these circles and move them down here. And let's move these over. Okay. And then I'm going to take a few more circles and put them down here. And let's just move all these down. Okay, so I've created a little simple polka dot pattern. And so there's a couple things that I can use variables for in here that are really going to save me a lot of time. And as we go through the semester, we're going to see even more ways of creating more efficient versions of our code. So one of the things that we want to look for when we're creating a variable, anytime we're using the same number like multiple times, that's a good sign that a variable might be more useful in this case. So notice the size of my circles is all the same, and it's all the same number, right? But let's say I wanted to try my polka dot pattern, but with a slightly different number. That would be kind of hard, right? I'd have to go through and change this. Okay, that looks okay, but it's not exactly right. Let's see how it looks with all the other ones. So that's a good example of where it would be a lot easier if I could change all these numbers at one time. So that's a good chance to use a variable. So let's put in a variable here, and I'm going to put it up at the top of my program. Let me put a little comment in here. Variable examples. Okay, so I'm going to put my variables up here. You could actually put them in the draw function, but we only need to make them once. So if we only need to do something once, usually I do it at the top of the program. So I'm going to make a variable called polka dot size, and I'm going to set it to 100. And so now I'm just going to take this polka dot size and replace all of the size hard-coded numbers with polka dot size in here. Okay, so it still looks the same, but now if I change this, I can change all of them at the same time. And this also makes my program a lot easier to read, right? Like if I sent this to somebody and I didn't explain to them anything about the program at all, and they were just looking at this and they were like, okay, let's see, there's a bunch of circles and they're all the same size. And okay, this is the size. So if I want to change the dot size, I can change it here. So if I want to see what would it look like at 60, there you go. All of the polka dots update at the same time. Okay, so that's one way that's really useful. Another thing that I can do is set the different colors. So let's say I just want one color for all of them. I can say fill blue, and I'll say no stroke up here. Okay, so that's pretty easy. And if I wanted to change this, I wouldn't actually need a variable because I could just write red here and it changes all of them, right? The difference is if I wanted to have two different colors. So let's say I wanted to have a blue line followed by a red line followed by another blue line. Oops, oops, there we go. Okay. All right, so now if I wanted to change it, I'd have to change the blue and the blue or change the red. Excuse me, I still have just a tiny bit of a cough left. Anyway, but if I want to change these at the same time, I can just make a variable. So I could make like, color uh, 1 and set it equal to blue. And then I could say color 2 equals red. And so then I could have for my fill color 1. Notice that my variables do not have quotation marks, whereas my hard-coded colors do. So that's another difference to look out for is that when we're writing variables or functions or keywords, we're not using quotation marks because it's just regular parts of our program. It's only when we're writing data like colors or text data or other types of data, that's the only time that we need those quotation marks. So then for red, I can say color 2. And for blue, I can say color 1 again. And now I can make all these adjustments without really looking at my program. I can just do it up here. I can say like, okay, what if I tried purple? And that looks pretty good. So what if I trade red with pink? So I can start to make adjustments to my design with a few simple variables and I don't have to like read through all my code. This isn't a ton of code, but imagine, some of you guys had some pretty complex self-portraits. Imagine like a really complex drawing, like you could have lots and lots of code rather than search through all your code to find the parts that you want to change. You'll end up when you start to write programs like this, you'll have all the main pieces of data up at the top of the program. Okay. So just a little bit more before I'll give you guys some time to work on your projects. So the next thing I'm going to show is updating our self-portrait. And ultimately what we want, and this is just for an exercise, this isn't because it's the only way to do it, but it's an exercise for you guys to learn how to approach this. We want to replace every single hard-coded number and color in our program with a variable. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, do I really need a variable just to change this one thing? But this is about practice. This isn't about, actually how we should write a program necessarily. Although ultimately you'll find that variables are better to use in a lot of cases. So anyway, I'm going to go to a new tab and I'm going to open up the self-portrait that I created last week. So let me find that real quick. Here we go, self-portrait. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a couple modifications here. It looks, I kind of forgot what it looks like. But mostly what I'm going to do is start to replace variables, numbers with variables. That's one approach. The other approach, which I'll demonstrate next week, is instead of going through and replacing numbers with variables, which may seem kind of tedious, why don't I just redraw the self-portrait but using variables instead? That might be a better approach. But one thing that I'm going to be looking out for in this case that's a little bit different than what we looked at with our pattern is I also want, and this is something that we'll work on a little bit more next week, I want to sort of be aware of the relationship between my variables. So for example, if the head starts at 200 and the body starts at 200, I want one variable for that. I don't want two, right? I could have two different variables like the body X and the head X, but if those are the same thing, I should be using one variable if it's describing a similar piece of data. So that's where you have to do a little bit more analytical thinking of like, what does this actually represent? Is it its own value, or are there more things that are kind of related to this? So that might take a while to get. You don't, if it may be a little confusing at first, but that's what we're going to try to kind of go for. I'm going to get rid of some of the comments that I was putting in here last time since they're not relevant anymore. Okay, and let's change this. So this is my self-portrait with variables. And this is the 15th. Okay. So basically what I'm going to start to do is just look through my whole program. Anytime I see a number or a string, I need to replace that with a variable. So some of these are going to be really easy. Other ones are going to be take a little bit more work. I'm not going to do like the whole thing because that would take me a while. But I'm just going to show you guys a few examples. Maybe I'll go through like the first maybe up to like here, something like that. And then I'll give you guys time to start on your own. So the background is 50. That's easy. I'll just say like, variable background color. You can use shortcuts here. So like an easy shortcut could be BG color, but BG for background, and just set that to 50. And then I can put that in here. Then this fill I'm not actually using, so let's just get rid of that. And then we have another fill here. So this is where I want to start to think about what does this really represent. So this fill is kind of like the main color of my self-portrait. It's like the main color of the character. So I'm going to say, for this one, I'm going to say variable portrait main color. That's pretty long. Let's just call it main color. And you could use different ones in here. You might have like hair color, skin color, eye color, something that's descriptive. Another thing with our variables is we want it to be obvious what they mean, what they stand for, so that other people can read the code and understand it. So the main color is plum. And so now I'll replace this plum with main color. And then I don't think I used it again, but let's just go make sure. So I'm going to go look through and see if I used plum anywhere else. And it doesn't look like I did, so that's fine. So, if I want to change the main color to like blue or something like that, I can do that. That actually looks kind of cool. Maybe I'll stick with that. Um, and then I can continue. Okay, so that wasn't too bad. I've already knocked out two. So then stroke weight, here is a hard-coded number. This is the stroke weight. And this is really for like the eyes. I don't really use it for anything else. So let's make a variable for that. So let's say variable eye line, or let's just call it weight. That'll be clear enough what it is. So I think I did it as 6. So that's pretty easy. And then once I have that right, I just take this and replace it there. And it still works the same way. And then if I want to change it, I can change it. That actually looks kind of better. So I'll leave that for now. Rect mode center, I can leave this alone. Center is a variable. It's a specific type of variable called a constant. When you see all capital letters, that means it's a constant. That means it can't change. So center means one specific thing, and P5 is saying, by making it all caps, it's saying we don't want to change this. I'll put a little note here. All caps means constant. But for our purposes, it means we can ignore this line of code. Okay, now we've got a bunch of numbers here. So we're going to start to think about what do these numbers mean. So the first one is like the center of the body. And for this, I'm going to use x. I'm going to use this is my main x. So I'm going to say variable x equals 200. And then anytime I think I can get away with it, I'm going to replace 200 with x. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I think this here, this 200 is an x, right? As well as these, okay? Because they're talking about the center of these eyes, okay? Same thing with these 200s. These are all the same. If it's the same number and it's in the same column, that first argument, that means it's probably an x variable. So I've actually got a lot of x's here. The nose even has an X in it. Actually, there's X here and then there's X here as well. My triangle has an X and an X and an X. Are those really all the same? Yeah, they are. Okay. And then my quad, I don't see any X's in my quad, so I'm going to leave that alone for now. Okay, so this is where it starts to get pretty cool. I put in a ton of different x's, and now if I move x, watch this, if I put x is 300, so everything shifted because now it's all relative to this variable because I have, instead of 200 plus 20, I have x plus 20. And so I can even do something like this where I say, and this is what we're going to work on more next week, but just as a preview, if I say x equals mouse x, now I can move the whole self-portrait just by moving the mouse. So that's how we can start to add functionality to our program that we wouldn't normally be able to do just with a regular piece of software. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that for now. Let's set x back to 200 and let's keep going. I'll just do a couple more things. So then the next value here is y. That's the y for the head, but obviously the head and the body have different numbers. There's also this 150 down here and here and here. So there's a lot of 150s, which could be the head X. Let's make one or Y. So let's make our, I think what I'll do is I'll set the Y value to 150 because there's a lot of them. You don't have to do this. I'm just kind of looking at the code and seeing that there's a lot of 150s that are Ys. So why don't I go ahead and set Y to 150 and then I'll set the other stuff based on that. So anytime I see a 150 in a Y area, I'm going to put Y. So here's my arc, X plus 20, 150, put a Y, put a Y, then my eyes. So I have all this stuff that's centered around the head, the eyes, the glasses, all of this stuff. So these Ys are pretty easy to do. If you did your self-portrait differently, you're not going to have exactly the same stuff. So you may not have as many kind of like easy options as I do here. The mouth doesn't, it's not clear what the mouth is, so I'm just going to leave that for now. But that's pretty good. So now if I run this and I change Y to like 200, now the whole body moves down. It looks like it's behind the body. That's kind of weird. Let's say if I keep going, I guess it's behind the graphic. Let's put this back at 150. I'll say Y equals mouse Y. Okay, yeah, it's just behind that big quad that I put in there for no reason. Okay, so there's my Y. That's pretty good. Let's go to the next bit. So then the Y for the body, I could put that as a separate variable, or I could just define it according to this Y. So like one thing I could say is like Y plus 200. That's the same value. If I say Y plus 100, then the body's going to move. So you can define your variables relative to other variables as long as you have a variable name here. I don't mind if you have something hard-coded here. So this 200 is technically hard-coded, but because it's offset by a variable, it'll work if I do something like this, y equals mouse y. Okay, so now the whole body's moving. So as long as your variable is relative to, or your value is relative to a variable, that's fine. Okay, so I'm just going to do a few more of these. So we have some more numbers here. This is the size of the body, 200, 250, and that's the rounded corners. So none of those things are really going to be reused. So for those, I just kind of have like a bunch of, they're really honestly just, single variables. It's not the kind of thing I would probably normally write, but just for the sake of the exercise, we want to be, comprehensive. So I'm going to say, let's say variable body width is 200, variable body height is 250, and then variable body, or let's just call this like, it's kind of like the shoulders. So let's say shoulder round equals 50. And then I just have to replace those. So some of these are going to be tedious and they're not really going to like give us much to work with, but it'll just help us kind of come up with new variable names and be exhaustive in the approach to this assignment. Okay, so then for the head, we have a head size and have a head width and a head height. I'm not really sure if I repeat those values anywhere, so it's not very exciting. But let's just go ahead and make those. So we have variable head width equals 100, variable head height equals 150. And the one advantage of things like this is it does really make it very clear what these numbers represent, right? You may, when you're looking at this line of code, you're like, okay, this is the head. Okay, this is the XY, so that's where the head is. But what does this mean? And what does this mean? Unless you know the variables, unless you have that memorized, you may not know. But if you have names for these numbers that make it clear what they are, that's helpful. Okay, then I have a stroke, which is a bunch of different colors. So this one is actually pretty tricky because I have three numbers here. Um, so let me go over that real quick. I wanted to get to this part. Um, so yeah, let's just do those real quick. So for the colors, there's a couple different ways that I could do this. But without like getting into more details about certain things, the easiest way is just to have variables for each one. So I can have variable, um, what is this color? So I'm using this yellow color as kind of like the face features, um, or it's mainly just the eyes and the nose. Uh, okay, so I'm just gonna call this what did I have before? I had the main color. I'll just call this like the face color. And then I need three different numbers. That's the tricky part. I need a red value, and then I'm gonna have face color, green value, face color, blue value. So there's other ways that you could do this with different approaches with programming that are a little less repetitive, but just to kind of keep things in the same theme of creating these variables, we're just going to use this. So I have 241 is the red value. I have 237 is the green value, and 102 is the blue value. So then I just have to replace those numbers. So I have face color R, face color G for green, and face color B for blue. Okay, so that survived, so that looks good. So then the last little bit I'll do is just like coming back to the example we saw earlier. I have the two eyes, and they have the same width and the same height. And then pi is actually a variable. Um, it's another constant, so we can ignore that. This 0 is not a constant, but let's ignore this. Let's say don't worry about the arcs because, well, actually, it could be kind of cool to have this as a variable. Um, let's just do these and then we'll move on. So I can have a variable I size or I width equals 20, variable I height equals 50. And then I would replace both of these. So I width here and I height here. And then what I wanted to show, so we have those eyes, right? So one thing that you may notice, the eye width is 20. And there's another place where we see 20 here. It's right here, x plus 20. And we might wonder, are those things related? Well, they kind of are because our eyes are a certain, amount apart, and that is relative to how big they are. If they were really big, we need to move them farther apart. So we could say maybe this 20 is the same as our eye width. So we could say, well, we could say x plus eye width or x minus eye width. And so now we can actually update two different things at the same time since they're relative to each other. Let's put it here and here as well, and also here and here. So anytime we notice that the values are the same, here's my glasses as well, they're all 20. So even though they're doing two different things, we can use that eye width variable for a bunch of different stuff. So now if I change the eye width to something larger, notice they also move farther away. So now they're kind of too big for my head, although it does kind of look cool. And so notice that everything is increasing when I increase the size of the eyes. If I make them much smaller, now those are too close together. But if I just did like a small increase, you can see that they're moving away as they're getting bigger. So that's a really useful thing for variables as well. The eye height, I'm not sure I can get the same uh, value out of that because my glasses are a different size, but I could use minus there. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I think I've demonstrated enough, and I want to make sure to give you guys some time to do your work. But notice how different my code looks than when I started. I had a bunch of numbers that were they were doing their job. They were working well. But now I can actually read my code almost like it's a description of something. When I'm starting the code, it's like, okay, I have the main color, and then I'm starting at the XY position, and I'm drawing this body with the body width, body height, and I'm drawing this head with the head width and the head height. Then I have a color for the face. I have red, green, and blue for the face. Then I have these eyes, and one eye is, to the right, one eye is to the left. They're both the same Y position. They have the same width. They have the same height. So with variables, our code is easier to modify, but it's also easier to read. It's easier to understand. So I have a lot left to do. I have like the size of these eyeballs. I have this color here. I guess I could fill in. I already have something for this. What is it? It's the eye weight. Okay, so I have that already. So I have another fill here. I actually need 4 numbers there because I have an alpha value for my glasses. Then I have some numbers here. I have another color here. This is actually a color string that I can use. These I can ignore because I have the x plus, y plus, so those numbers are fine. These y numbers I need to change, and then all of these guys I need to change. But other than that, I've pretty much done the whole thing. So that's the assignment. It's taking your self-portrait and it's replacing all the variables or all the numbers and strings with variables. And then you define the variables up here at the top. And you don't have to, but where you can, use one variable for as many numbers as you can, as long as it makes sense. That's kind of the analytic process. Um, the other way to do this assignment, of course, is just to redraw your self-portrait, but use variables from the beginning. I'll do a little demo of that next week, but you guys can try this first, and then we'll do that version next week, and you can decide which one is going to be better to use in the long run. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and I'll put a link to this in the voice chat, and I'm going to stop the recording.